Hello and welcome to our weekly look at the war inside Syria. I'm Stephen Cole. As the government forces intensify attacks from the air and on the ground, aimed at stamping out opposition strongholds from Aleppo and elsewhere, the world is asking whether or not Syria is in a state of civil war. Any change in status of the conflict would mean combatants would be subject to the Geneva Convention, potentially allowing prosecutions for war crimes. Well, in July, the International Committee of the Red Cross described the fighting in Syria as a civil war. A month before, the UN's head of peacekeeping, Hervé Ladsous, also said Syria was in a state of civil war. The Syrian government says speaking about civil war in the country contradicts reality. All the while, inside Syria, civilians continue to pay the heaviest of prices. Zaina Hodder has this report.
There is no doubt who is still in command. And this is a way of showing it. Aleppo's countryside, the stronghold of the Free Syrian Army, was yet again hit by an airstrike from a MiG fighter jet. 2 people were killed and at least a dozen injured when their homes were attacked. The Syrian military has threatened more attacks like this one if FSA units who use this region as a rear base don't withdraw from the city of Aleppo. But in Syria's financial capital, the rebels are digging in for what is increasingly looking like a long war. Some civilians are no longer able to cope. Ahmad decided it was time to leave as the battle for the city entered its second month. The Syrian military, she says, was not sparing anyone believed to be associated with the opposition. That is why Ahmad preferred not to reveal her identity.
They are targeting civilians with their planes and artillery. If they were real men, let them confront the Free Syrian Army on the ground, face to face. This is not a fair fight.
Areas where the opposition has set up base have been coming under heavy bombardment. More often than not, the civilians who remain here are the ones who are getting killed and injured. The shelling and strikes have been described as indiscriminate. The Syrian authorities have accused their opponents of using civilians as human shields. That charge, however, has been disputed by those who decided that they had no other choice but to take up arms to defend themselves.
When we were protesting peacefully, the security forces attacked us. So we are not to blame for taking up arms. We didn't bring war to our people. They did.
It is as if time has stopped in opposition-controlled neighborhoods. Out of choice or against their will, communities here are being punished for harboring the fighters. The opposition has armed men on the ground in this neighborhood. The state has its informers even in rebel territory. This is a war with no front line. Those who didn't take up arms have found themselves in the middle of a conflict. Anyone is a target of the Syrian army where the FSA is holed up. People have been killed in government strikes while lining up outside bakeries. And civilians in these neighborhoods seem resigned to the possibility that they could be next. Zaina Hodder, Al Jazeera, Aleppo City.
As we mentioned earlier, the International Committee of the Red Cross has called the conflict in Syria a civil war. So, what is the definition of a civil war? Well, it's a high-intensity conflict between organised groups within the same nation, state or republic. The aim of one side may be to take control of the country or region. Another category of a civil war involves regular armed forces, which are sustained, organised and large-scale. Large numbers of casualties and the consumption of significant resources would also constitute a civil war. The Geneva Convention lays out the rules of war. The ICRC will hold the combatants involved accountable to the Geneva Conventions, and this means that either sides of conflict, whether the Syrian government or opposition, could be prosecuted by the International Criminal Court for crimes against humanity. So, is Syria in a state of civil war or not? Let's put that question and more to our guests. In Washington, D.C., Rafif Jouejati, a Syrian opposition activist. She's also the English language spokeswoman for the Syrian Local Coordination Committee. In London, Nadim Shehadi, Associate Fellow at the Middle East and North Africa Programme at Chatham House. In Ankara, Yusuf Kanli, a columnist and a former editor of the Turkish Hurriyet Daily News. Welcome to all three of you. Ibrahim Brahimi is the new UN ambassador, the man tasked with brokering peace. He believes Syria has evolved into a civil war, and this is what he has to say. I believe that has been the case for some time. What we need to do is to stop the civil war, and that is not going to be easy. Yusuf, is there civil war in Syria?
Of course there is civil war in Syria. It's not new. I mean, it has been continuing for the past 17 months. But somehow, because of perhaps semantics reasons, people are preferred to call it unrest, opposition movement, rebel movement, whatever.
Nadim Shehadi, is there civil war in Syria?
Well, semantics are very important in this conflict because there are two opposing narratives. One narrative says that this is a peaceful, non-violent revolt by civilian population against the legitimacy of the regime. And the other narrative says that this is a conspiracy and terrorists and all that, but it also tries to frighten the international community and its own population by projecting that this is a civil war, which means they are saying it's going to be chaos like Iraq, and it suggests that whenever you get rid of a dictatorship, that's what happens, or when you destabilize the regime, that's what happens. And President Assad himself and many of his supporters have been using that language. It's almost like blackmail. If you destabilize us, if something happens to us, then the whole region will go up in flames. It will be the Third World War, or Iraq, Afghanistan, and Lebanon all over again. So I think semantics are important in this case.
All right, I want to move on to Rafif Jouejati. Are all the ingredients there for a civil war? Do you believe one is happening, being fought at the moment?
No, I don't. We actually reject the label of civil war because we go back to how this revolution started with peaceful protests. The peaceful protests continue throughout the country every day, every week, all over in every governorate. Now that the Assad regime has forced the militarization of the revolution, but he, in fact, himself has declared a war against his people. I would call this a humanitarian war against the Syrian people.
Are those semantics?
Perhaps they're semantics, but they're very, very important. We have to take into account the perspective of the civilians on the ground, the 2 million people internally displaced, the more than 200,000 people who are now refugees in neighboring countries. We have to take a look at the fact that more than 25,000 people have been murdered. We have to look at Assad crimes against humanity.
Yusuf, you believe there is a civil war. What then is the significance of the International Committee of the Red Cross now declaring it, in their view, officially a civil war?
First of all, of course, no one can support the Assad regime and its atrocities committed in Syria. But no one can either, no one with a clear heart can support either the atrocities committed by the opposition groups who say they are waging a humanitarian war. Because there is a bloody war continuing on there, and it's a civil war. And of course, the Red Cross describing as such, as you at the beginning of the program said, describing a war as civil war means both sides are accountable to what they are doing. First of all, two, the international community should primarily try to restore peace and order in that country if they are to intervene. They are not. They cannot support an insurgency. That's where semantics is important.
Nadim Shehadi, why is the International Committee of the Red Cross the only official organisation so far to have come out and said this is civil war?
It's not really the only official organization. There's been there has been a UN official, Mr. Latsus, who said that. Secretary Clinton said it. Prime Minister Cameron said it. There's lots of declarations that this is a Syrian civil war. You even see it as a banner on many of the televisions and media. And I think that part of the mind game that the regime plays with the international community and with its own people is to project the idea that the dictatorship is indispensable and irreplaceable, and after it will be civil war like Iraq and etc. and chaos and Al-Qaeda and whatever. So that's why and it worked. It worked with. This is why the international community has been so hesitant in protecting the civilians in Syria. So it's a very important semantic distinction.
Yusuf Kanli, where are the fault lines in Syria? If it's a civil war, who's fighting who?
That is the problem. I mean, in Syria, there is an organized, they call it Free Syria Army. It's an organized group supported by some outside countries, including Turkey, this way or the other. And this is waging a war against the government of the country. This cannot be just an opposition group. There is a war continuing on there. That's the fault line.
Rafif Jouejati, that's a very strong point, isn't it?
Well, it's a strong point, except that I disagree with it. The Free Syrian Army does not have a centralized command and control. The Free Syrian Army does not control determined areas of territory within Syria. There's a continuing power struggle. But I go back to the original point. The regime has waged a war against a civilian population. The response has been that defected soldiers, rather than shoot at unarmed civilians, have taken up their own weapons and are trying to defend civilians. So I think the other guest is trying to very narrowly define something that cannot be narrowly defined.
Nadim Shehadi, if this is a civil war, is it perhaps then more accurately a variety of opposition groups, possibly clans, different militias, who all want different outcomes, but the only link between them is the fall of Assad?
Well, yes, and this is natural in the sense that if you think that this is not really an opposition, it's wrong to call it an opposition versus a regime. This is the whole of Syrian society emerging after almost half a century of not being able to do any politics. And Syrian society is very diverse, religiously, ethnically, ideologically, and there are regional differences. So, and this will be the makeup of future democratic Syria. It's part of the strength of the opposition that it is that diverse. It's wrong to expect a united opposition with a strong leader. It's like wishing for another Assad. And in a way, some of the language that the international policymakers use is almost like wishing for another Assad, because before that, they were engaging with Assad. They believed that he was the stabilizer. They believed that if dictatorship was the only way to rule the region. That if a dictator falls, then you have an Iraq situation, and so engagement was the key word in international policy. As a reaction to what happened in Iraq and as a reaction to the Bush administration's policy. So right. It's only recently that the language has been slightly changing vis-a-vis Assad, not really wishing that he stays.
Nadim Shehadi, do you recognise this change of language?
Yes, I do. I mean, the change of language is you can see it from the declarations before. The people were worried about what happens after Assad, and they were asking whether the opposition is united, whether there's Al Qaeda, where there's extremists, or whether Islamists will come to power, and all that. Now, the main idea is, or the language suggests, that the longer Assad stays in power, or clings to his seat, because he doesn't have any power now, the longer he destroys the country, the more he destroys the country, then he will be creating sectarian tension and extremism and poverty and all the things we fear. So the arguments that the regime was using are now turning against it.
Yusuf Kanli, let's turn to a little bit towards the diplomacy and where we started with Dr. Brahimi, who talked about a civil war in the first place. He said in his sort of handover speech, or in response, that he's flattered and scared about his new role, but he says he'll serve the Syrian people. Which of the Syrian peoples will he serve?
Of course, I mean, like his predecessor Annan, he will have to talk with all groups in Syria as much as possible. But he is right in his assessment that he's scared with the task, because Syria issue has become more than a hot potato. I mean, what are you going to do with it? It's impossible to have a settlement with Assad there. But it is impossible to have a settlement tomorrow either. There has to be some kind of a calming down of the situation and the transition. How that will be done is that's the task of Brahimi and perhaps other Brahimis that will follow.
Rafif Jouejati, do you sense any sense that the time is right for diplomacy now, or is this hurtling towards a bloody denouement?
Well, it's already hurtled. It's already bloody. That we look at the extent of the destruction the Assad regime is willing to inflict across the country. Certainly, the new joint envoy should be scared. He's dealing with a regime that has consistently agreed to abide by international suggestions and plans, and has consistently failed to implement them. Of course he should be scared. This is going to be very challenging for him, and I suspect he'll meet the same failure that Mr. Annan did.
Let's hear from him, the peace envoy you're talking about. The man now charged with brokering peace is a veteran Algerian diplomat, Lakhdar Brahimi, who told the UN Secretary General that the mission left him, quote, flattered, humbled and scared.
When you called me, I told you that I was honored, flattered, humbled and scared. I'm still in that frame of mind. And about how I was going to serve the United Nations and yourself, the Arab League and Dr. Nabil Arabi, but above all the Syrian people. They will be our first masters.
Nadim Shehadi, Kofi Annan, all of us know, is a veteran UN negotiator and player all around the world. Dr. Brahimi, too, is a very experienced diplomat. Kofi Annan failed. How do you assess the chances of the new peace envoy?
Well, it is a difficult task, but the task is not internal in Syria. I don't think this can be resolved or should be resolved with dialogue between the opposition and the regime. There is absolutely no trust there, and such an endeavor is bound to fail. His task should be to unite the international community either at the UN, where the Russians should stop using their veto and help with the transition. They in a way are the best placed to come and tell Assad that the game is over and that he should leave. This is what they did with Milosevic. It wasn't the NATO bombing that got rid of Milosevic in Serbia. So his task is more outside to mobilize the international community which has been paralyzed so far, inefficient.
If it is, if its task is to mobilise the outside community, Yusuf Kanli, does his task necessarily mean, on top of his declaration there's a civil war, mean that outside intervention is more likely now?
First of all, I would join my friend in London that his task is outside, of course, primarily. But don't forget, Libya flop is haunting everything. In Libya, the West acted dishonestly, cheated Russia, and now Russia is not taking any move on anything. This is very important, has to be underlined. And I don't think Russia will say yes to any resolution that would involve direct foreign intervention in Syria.
What about outside intervention without the backing of the UN? Rafif Jouejati, do you see that happening?
I don't think I see that happening in the immediate future. Certainly the international community has indicated that it will not put boots on the ground. We're talking about some airstrikes, perhaps no-fly zones. Certainly many people in Syria are calling for this because they're looking for any mechanism to stop the Assad violence against them. Now, with regard to Russia, certainly Russia is vetoing anything that calls for Assad stepping down, but not taking into consideration what the people on the ground are saying every day. Every single day, Ashab yurid escalates nizam, they're saying it very loud and clear. I know that Russia felt slighted by the treatment of Libya, but the Syrian people really don't care whether or not it felt slighted. What they're looking at is a murderous regime that has created a humanitarian catastrophe.
Nadim Shehadi, do you see military intervention without UN backing?
Well, you know, it's what's really interesting in this situation is that we have a battle of hearts and mind in reverse. In Iraq and Afghanistan, it was the Americans, after having invaded the country, trying to convince the population that the invasion was good to get rid of the despotic regime and that they need freedom and democracy. Now you have the Syrians saying that we want freedom and we want democracy and asking for an international intervention. So they're trying to win the hearts and minds of the international community. And there is a cost for intervention, of course, but I think there is a cost which is much higher for non-intervention, and this cost is increasing by the day. So that's what needs to be calculated, the balance of consequences between non-intervention and intervention.
And Yusuf Kanli, that balance of consequences, do you think it'll come down in favour of outside intervention?
An intervention without UN mandate would mean putting entire Middle East on fire, including Turkey, including Iran. It will be a disaster, a catastrophe. I don't think Turkey should be part of it, or any other country who should be part of it, but it seems that there are very serious efforts to pull Turkey into this plot.
If Brahimi, finally and very briefly, if Brahimi can't broker peace, is there a single country in the world that both sides would listen to now?
I mean, unless Russia clearly tells Assad that it's time to pack and go, I don't think there will be a diplomatic resolution, a peaceful resolution of the Syrian conflict.
Rafif,
sooner or later.
Okay, if he doesn't listen to Russia, who will he listen to? Rafif, same question to you.
I don't know that any single player in the international community can put an end to this, but I believe that the Syrian people can.
All right,
I believe
the Syrian people can. All right, Nadim Shehadi.
Well, I think that American leadership is the key to this.
All right, America is the key. So we've got Russia, we've got America and the Syrian people. All right, thank you all very much indeed. And thank you too in Washington, D.C., Rafif Jouejati, in London, Nadim Shehadi, and in Ankara, Yusuf Kanli. And I also want to thank you for watching. On the hour, around the clock, Al Jazeera's coverage of the situation in Syria goes on. We also have background and analysis on our website, aljazeera.com. And you can watch this programme again on the site. But for now, that's it from me, Stephen Cole, and the team. See you next week when we have another look inside Syria. For now, bye-bye.